The race is on, and Lando Norris made it back-to-back wins with a masterful victory at Zandvoort, so he's a shoo-in as my number one in the post-race driver rankings. Or is he? And just how low will Max Verstappen rank after his messy exit from his home race? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to discuss how I rank the drivers' performances after the Dutch Grand Prix is Ben Anderson. Ben, welcome back. You're becoming a semi-regular foe on this podcast.
Yeah, I'm not as regular as I'd probably like to be. Contrary to my modus operandi, I have not been available enough, Ed, which is quite shocking in the history of the Race F1 podcast. But I'm available for this race. I was working the Zandvoort weekend. I was watching the race, quite an interesting, more old school throwback tyre race, a bit like Barcelona. So I'm sure you enjoyed ranking the drivers after this one because we weren't talking about energy starvation and batteries and whatnot.
I never really enjoy doing the rankings because there's never enough time. That's the problem. So I do enjoy the process, but ideally I'd need about a week to do it properly. But nobody wants to wait a week.
Yeah.
Anyway, shall we run down the rankings? And just as a reminder to everyone, it's a full weekend performance ranking, not just a race ranking. So the whole sprint weekend is what I'm evaluating. So let's give the chart rundown. 22nd, Max Verstappen. 21st, Carlos Sainz. 20th, Gabriel Bortoleto. 19th, Lance Stroll. 18th, Ollie Behrman. 17th, Sergio Perez. 16th, Valtteri Bottas. 15th, Oscar Piastri. 14th, Kimi Antonelli. 13th, Franco Colapinto. 12th, Yuki Tsunoda. 11th, Nico Hülkenberg. 10th, Arvid Lindblad. 9th, Esteban Ocon. 8th, Alex Albon. 7th, Lewis Hamilton. 6th, Charles Leclerc. 5th, George Russell. 4th, Pierre Gasly. 3rd, Liam Lawson. 2nd, Fernando Alonso. And 1st, Lando Norris. So, Ben, I could hand over the interrogation responsibilities to you, aided and abetted by the Race Members Club, who have been sending in their "what the hell are you thinking" questions as well. If you're interested in the Race Members Club and joining in this particular fun, head to patreon.com and search for The Race, or hit the link in the episode description. Right, Ben, what's first?
Right, well, we'll come back to your shoe-ins for first and last, as you previewed later on. I want to start with the Ferrari drivers. They were obviously a big talking point post-race because of the strategy fumbling with Leclerc and Hamilton, which obviously led to some more spicy radio exchanges with the pit wall. Will Pearce wants to know how Ferrari's strategy, or lack thereof, impacted Hamilton's ranking, because he feels there was strong race pace there at the end that he basically just wasn't able to exploit.
Yeah, there was strong race pace. Actually, both the Ferraris had strong race pace. They were on quite different strategies in terms of what tyres they were on at what times for a big chunk of the race, which made that comparison pretty tricky. I'm not sure that the strategy impacted it a huge amount, because ultimately, Hamilton, if he'd had a bit more of a run at Russell, would probably have got past him. So that might have changed things, because you had to look at it and think, well, he didn't get ahead of Russell and there was the possibility to. But he could have had a few more laps, and he could have also not had that late VSC that just temporarily cooled that battle. So maybe it's a case where there's a small amount, because it could have turned that he didn't pass Russell into he did pass Russell, but it wasn't a huge amount. I actually thought both Hamilton and Leclerc had really strong weekends for the most part. It's a little bit difficult to unravel the qualifying weakness relatively of the Ferrari to their performances, because they have this frustrating problem of they probably had the pace to fight for better results. Well, they certainly had the race pace to fight for better results, but they were always disadvantaged in terms of track position because of that qualifying weakness.
In the end, you had Leclerc ahead of Hamilton, but Leclerc was he ahead in qualifying? Hang on, I need to check. Was he ahead in qualifying, or did Hamilton beat him?
No, Leclerc was ahead, was emphatically ahead through the sprint element of the weekend. And then, in qualifying, Leclerc had, I've just got my notebook down here, which is why I'm looking to remind myself. Sprint weekends, it's very easy to conflate qualifying sessions. But main qualifying was where Leclerc ended up behind by a chunk, but he struggled a bit because they changed the power delivery settings into Q3, and that sort of threw him off a little bit. Again, that doesn't mean Hamilton didn't do a good job, because he did. So I actually thought overall Hamilton and Leclerc were at a very, very similar level throughout the weekend.
So what tipped it in Leclerc's favour in the end? Because you've got a fairly close qualifying battle, but mitigating circumstances for Leclerc in qualifying, as you just mentioned, and then Hamilton obviously being stronger in the race and ahead in the end, even with the slightly fumbled team instruction and pit stops near the end. So yeah, what made you choose Leclerc over Hamilton?
It was almost a bit of a coin toss, because somebody has to be ahead, but ultimately the sprint race drive from Leclerc did play a part. On the softs, passing Lando Norris to get that second place. So
you had a tiebreaker in there, basically.
Yeah, you sort of try and look for those sorts of things. But in an ideal world, well, not an ideal world, because it's hedging, really. The format forces you to choose one or the other. And I think if I did this 100 times, I'd probably be about 50-50 in terms of who's ahead, because I thought they both had very strong weekends. And on balance, it was relatively even.
Yeah, we don't allow you to have ties. That's the beauty of the rankings format. Let's move on to
That's
another.
why I've got the open neck shirt. I'm not allowed ties.
Let's move on to another pair of teammates. The Mercedes drivers are always a big talking point, and it's quite fun when they're far apart in your rankings, like they were this weekend. And also when the quicker of them and the more successful of them is the one ranked lower, and in this case, much lower. We obviously had a few questions about this. So Stuart Coulter and Paul Southgate both thought 14th for Antonelli was too low, with Paul calling it very harsh and asking, don't results count for anything? While Andrea Hanna thought Russell was the slower of the two, but had the cleaner weekend, and figured that dynamic was similar to what we saw between the McLaren drivers, where there weren't really many mistakes, just pace was lacking on Piastri's side. So Andrea wants to know, what makes more of a difference in your rankings? Is it mistakes or is it pace?
By and large, mistakes are influential, because drivers always use that annoying phrase execution, don't they? You hear a lot of athletes talking about this. But it's actually a really useful word, because I consider execution to be partly it's about what pace you've got, because that's executing the driving skills, but it's also how you use that pace as well. So, which is why you can get things like in Hungary. I talked about being quite impressed with Piastri, because he was struggling a lot on pace, but he had a damn good go at winning that Grand Prix, which impressed me, when you can do that when you are struggling a little bit. So you kind of lose a chunk on the pace, but you gain a bit back on the overall execution of the things other than the driving pace. The Mercedes drivers were really interesting, because I think there was a way for a Mercedes to win this Grand Prix. No question. Obviously, Russell had a mega sprint element of the weekend, winning from pole. So that was very, very positive for him. That was a big boost. And obviously the Grand Prix, Antonelli's was a little bit better. But the problem with Antonelli was, I feel kind of inherently he felt like he was a little bit, but he's by a small margin the faster Mercedes driver. But it seemed to come at a cost, because he was really scrappy. He had that off in SQ1 in sprint qualifying that damaged the floor. So that put him down the grid, and he ended up fourth in the sprint race and fifth on the grid. And that was because of that mistake. And then Q3, he managed to underdrive, basically. By his own admission, he overreacted a bit to those little spots of rain. The old thing of you drive to the grip, not what you see on your visor. And he backed off too much in turn one. And he lost a heap of time in turn one to Russell. And the rest of the lap, he's quicker than him. So there was that poor execution, and I think the way he was driving, he talked about this as well, but he never looked completely at one with the car. Zandvoort's a really interesting track, because it's a circuit that's got a lot of compromises in terms of how you drive the corners, how much you attack on the brakes, how much you try and carry speed through and maximize the exits, etc. The added complication of the power units, etc. And I feel like Antonelli didn't dance on that line quite so well, and that's why he was just a little bit scrappy throughout the weekend. There was quite a big difference in the approach. I was watching turn 3, the bank left-hander, in practice, and no two drivers had a more extreme difference of approach in Antonelli and Russell. You would see differences and people would converge, and the Mercedes drivers converged a bit, but you could see Antonelli was kind of doing the arrow it in and then try and get a little bit more aggressive rotation kind of mid-corner. Obviously, you have the apex sort of on the outside of the corner there, if you like, because of the banking, whereas Russell was kind of wall of deathing it a little bit more in terms of carrying the speed through. So Yeah, so this is what I did think Antonelli was scruffy. So I'd agree with the characterisation that Russell had the cleaner weekend and Antonelli had a bit of a messy one. And yeah, 14th looks a little bit harsh because he did finish second, but
Well,
underachieved
and
in the sprint race.
also he was the guy. If a Mercedes was going to do some winning in that Grand Prix, it was going to be him. So
Absolutely, yeah.
that's the business end of the weekend. I wonder if you look back on it, did you maybe slightly bias it towards the earlier part of the weekend when comparing those two, and maybe give Russell a bit too much credit for the lesser parts, and Antonelli not enough credit for the bit that matters?
Possibly. I mean, again, difference between 5th and 14th, as I always say, very, very small ultimately. But one of the underlying mentalities I had for this is that a Mercedes could absolutely have won this Grand Prix. So Antonelli's race drive was good, but I don't think it was the absolute maximum that was possible or anything. If it had been, maybe that would have carried a little bit more weight. But I didn't feel like either Mercedes driver got everything, and it was just that scruffiness. So, yeah, the bottom line is Antonelli could have won the Grand Prix. Russell could have won the Grand Prix. They had the machinery to do it, and neither did it. So there's a kind of asterisk against both of them. And I do think it's another one of those cases where a 9-step difference is. It almost exaggerates it because of how tightly packed everything is. But it was just that sustained scruffiness with Antonelli that hurt him in the end. Let's end the first part of the podcast by taking a look at how our Champions Tier members from the Race Members Club ranked the drivers. So, Ben, do you want to give us the rundown of the Champions top 10 and maybe let me know the difference between their ranking and mine?
With pleasure, Ed. So our members, our champions, had Pierre Gasly at number 10. You ranked him number 4. So quite a variance there. They had Nico Hulkenberg 9th. You had him 11th. Yuki Tsunoda came in at 8th. He was 12th in your rankings. Charles Leclerc was 7th, 6th in your rankings. Liam Lawson placed 6th for our champions. He was 3rd in your rankings. Lewis Hamilton made the top 5 for our members, but he was only 7th in your rankings. George Russell, quite evenly rated between you and the members. The members had him 4th. You had him 5th. So they were obviously clearly impressed with the cleanliness of George Russell's weekend after quite a tough run recently. Fernando Alonso placed in the top 3. He was 2nd in your rankings. Kimi Antonelli was 2nd for our members and only 14th, as we just discussed, in your rankings. So big difference in terms of how they interpreted Antonelli's scruffiness or not. And the number 1 universal pick between you and the members, Lando Norris, in the end runaway race winner.
Yeah, some interesting differences there. Now, I always do a podcast where basically I talk to myself and everybody gets to listen in for the Race Members Club when I just ramble about the champions rankings, the differences, why I think that might be, and just add a little bit more meat to the bone. So if you want to hear that, sign up for the Members Club. So head to Patreon, search for the Race Members Club, or hit the link in the episode description to join me there. Right, Ben, let's move on to part 2 of the podcast. What's next on your hit list?
Okay, let's go for Yuki Tsunoda. The members want to talk about his return to your driver rankings. He bowed out with a last place in Abu Dhabi last season, so a bad finish for Tsunoda, but he returned with a solid mid-grid 12th place at Zandvoort. Jamie Stark, who describes himself as a long-time Yuki defender, wants to know whether Tsunoda should have been considerably higher considering the learning curve with the new power units, only 1 free practice session on a sprint weekend, and how close in pace he was to Arvid Lindblad.
No, I'd say he shouldn't have been higher, but that's because he did a stealth blunder. And I call it a stealth blunder because it didn't turn up in the coverage at all, as far as I know. Maybe it turned up on the post-race coverage. It may have done the rounds on social media. But one of the things I do is, I'll notice during the race if things aren't quite where I think they should be. And after it would have been the lap 44 pit stop Tsunoda did, I was a bit puzzled about the gap to Gasly, and I made a little note in my notebook, so I'll just double check this. I assumed it was a slow pit stop, but actually it wasn't. And another thing I do is I'll look at each driver's run of lap times and look out for anomalies. So you'll see a lap that's slow and you think, okay, why is that? And sometimes it's blue flags, sometimes it's battle. But in this case, it turned out that on lap 43, so a full lap before he made his pit stop, turn 13, the fast right-hander turned in, rear stepped out, ploughed through the gravel, lost just over 6 seconds, and he did another lap round into the pits. Now, this is the phase where he'd been bought a nice cushion by Arvid Lindblad, being a rolling roadblock for Pierre Gasly. Gasly, I think, had pitted at this point. And then Tsunoda pitted. Now, Tsunoda still held the position, but he was a lot closer to Gasly. And then Gasly made the pass on him after that VSC restart, virtual safety car restart. That was when Esteban Ocon had stopped with the MGU-K problem, and he managed to ambush Tsunoda, make the pass, and get the last point. So that had to hurt Tsunoda. I actually punished him a bit less for it, if you want to think of it as punishing, than I would a usual driver, because I think other than that one moment, he had a hugely impressive weekend. I have no doubt he'd have been up there with Lawson, probably ahead of Lawson. So maybe third, maybe higher. I think this was a really impressive return from Tsunoda. Massively impressed by it. It was really good. It's just that one mistake which cost him the point had to count against him. Okay, yeah, he isn't experienced with this type of car and that car specifically, but we come back to that old thing of execution, don't we? He made a blunder, and it almost certainly cost him a point.
Yeah, I think, as we said before, mistakes count quite heavily against drivers when you're doing the rankings. Obviously, this was a stealth blunder, as you mentioned. So how close did Tsunoda come to absolutely careering into the wall and losing it all with that gravelly moment? Or was it one of those kind of easily survivable moments?
Yeah, I mean, it was survivable. He went fairly deep into the gravel, but there was never any chance he was going to hit the wall. Obviously, he stepped out and he collected it. So it wasn't kind of one where he's going to get beached in the gravel. He kept the forward momentum. I guess it had a little bit in common with the Antonelli sprint qualifying, first part of sprint qualifying off, same corner, through the gravel, may have damaged the floor as well. I'm not 100% sure about that because I didn't notice this happened until quite late on. So wasn't anyone I could ask about it at that point. So yeah, I don't think it was close to a full-on, it wasn't close to a full-on shunt or anything, but just, well into a stint. It happens, the mistakes happen. My punishment of mistakes is not some vast judgment on their overall ability, because they all make mistakes, of course. But it made what should have been a point-scoring finish into just a decent finish, and that was a shame, because I would say, and again, this is the difference in the mindset between what I'm trying to do with ranking and what I'm trying to do with overall weekend. I will say, and continue to say, Tsunoda had a really impressive return, really impressive. And you might think that should therefore mean he's ranked high. But again, execution, that one thing let him down, which is such a shame, because I thought it was great to see him back in the car and doing well. And I'm hopeful he gets a full-time ride in Formula One again. I'm not entirely sure where he'll get it in 27. Might have to wait till 28. But Tsunoda's got a lot to offer, and I think he reminded everybody of that.
Before we move on, I'd just like to ask you quickly about Tsunoda's good friend, Pierre Gasly. You mentioned him because obviously his race was defined by the Racing Bulls drivers. You placed him inside the top four, and we had a couple of questions about Gasly making mistakes in this race and struggling to pass Lindblad, who obviously, to be fair, was trying to roadblock Gasly, as you mentioned. How did he overcome these issues to rank so highly for you?
He sort of shuffled his way up the ranking as other factors were considered. Now, the one caveat I have to add is I will at some point watch probably all of Gasly's race on board, because I love sticking on boards on and just having them on. But that phase when he's behind Lindblad, I haven't been able to kind of do a lap by lap appraisal of it. But it is difficult to pass at Zandvoort, particularly when somebody's one mission is to hold you up. So I took a little bit of I had to take a little bit of a guess on that almost. But he just sort of filtered up, because I looked at it and I thought, well, he adapted well to the car. He was quick, really impressive in the sprint. He got P8 in the sprint. And to get a point in the sprint when you're in a midfield car, because there's four big teams, is always a really good achievement. So I was impressed by that. And he qualified well. And the qualifying, main qualifying problem, so I say he qualified well, but not as well as he could have done. But that was basically on the team. They completely messed up the outlet management, and he ended up having to let Liam Lawson through in the last corner and then go round Lawson in turn one, which just knackered his lap. I asked Gasly about this after the session. He said, "Oh, I'm more annoyed about other things." But in the car, he was really irritated. He says, "Come on, guys, you've got to give me more help here," because they compromised it. Without that, there's every chance he'd have led the midfield, and then he has a different race. Now, he may not have executed the race perfectly, and that was in my mind, but he was never a contender for number one. Let's put it that way. So it's possible that when I review in full that whole phase with Lindblad, I might say, actually, that's a bit generous, but I kind of, there's some things I just don't have time to do as I'd like to. So I'm willing to admit that there may have been an overly generous approach there, but I also know if you've got someone hell-bent on just getting in your way, it can be a right pain. Okay, Ben, I think you need to do a bit more talking. This is where we like to hand you the spotlight to shine on whatever aspect you particularly want, either for better or worse. So what have you chosen here, Ben? Good or evil?
I've gone for good. this time. Surprisingly, we had no specific questions about the other Red Bull stand-in driver from this race, Liam Lawson, subbing obviously at Red Bull for the injured Isak Hadjar. You placed him third, which is his equal best ranking of the season so far, along with Monaco. So why did his performance stand out for you in the context of his full season? And why did he impress you so much more than Tsunoda did?
With the caveat that I think Tsunoda would have slipped in ahead of him had he not had that off, I would say that, but basically because Tsunoda had the problem of not being familiar with this generation of cars at all. So all of that learning, he'd never driven a 26 F1 car with these power units. Yes, in the sim, but that doesn't count. He kept a bit sharp he'd done something like 4 TPC days, something of that order. But Lawson's challenge was different because he was jumping into a tricky Red Bull, albeit not quite as tricky as last year's car was. All of that baggage in the back of his mind, knowing it might just be a one race appointment, but the chance to exercise some demons, wasn't it? He obviously said, I was always confident. I knew I was treated poorly last year. I knew I could do this, etc. But there will have been things in the back of his mind. And that 2-race stint with Red Bull will have been a very bad memory for him. He's gone back into that environment, which is not necessarily easy to do. He had sort of spent Tuesday at the factory doing some prep and then Wednesday doing simulator work, then headed to Zandvoort. And right from the start of free practice, as I said, I was watching it turn 3. He looked decent. I mean, not at Verstappen's level, but of course he's not going to be at that level. But then in qualifying, certainly main qualifying, he was pretty close, just over a 10th off. Sprint qualifying, I think his underlying pace was better than it indicated. He looked like he, for all the world, was going to get to SQ3, but just struggled a bit as the track evolution ramped up in SQ2. So maybe a little bit of inexperience with the car. So I just thought he did a really good job. He struggled a bit in the race insofar as he was just on an island.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's any way for him to have bothered those ahead or behind. He may have benefited from Verstappen not being there as a measure. But also, hey, he wasn't the Red Bull driver whose car was reduced to a bag of bits at the end of the race. And if you were to say one Red Bull driver is going to do that, you'd have bet Lawson, wouldn't you? So I was impressed, and just the fact that he looked so all at sea, particularly China last year. I remember watching trackside and just thinking, oh, this weekend's going to be a disaster, because he just looked. He didn't look like he was dry. He didn't look like he was in the car. He looked like he was just behind it and hanging on. It was horrible, but just nice and assured, and just showing people what he could do. So I thought it was a very positive weekend from him from that perspective. But yeah, Tsunoda, I think, would have beaten him probably by one place without the off. Right, let's head into part 3 of the podcast now. And this is a good time to hit like or subscribe or all of those things, review the podcast. This helps us to get it out there and get it more visible, which is never a bad thing. And we really appreciate your support. So what are we going to open up part 3 with, Ben?
We're going to talk about Max Verstappen, Ed. This was his worst ranking ever, since we forced you to do rankings rather than driver ratings where you're allowed ties. Alex Hindley and Stuart Coulter both want to know what tipped the balance for placing Max last. They would have placed Sainz there, who, interestingly, after you took a load of heat over the summer for overrating, has now been second last in your rankings 2 races in a row. So there's definitely been some kind of correction there. They would have placed Sainz last because he was slower than Albon and also drove into him. So were there any other contenders for your wooden spoon besides Verstappen?
Sainz, I did consider, yes. I think it just came down to the size of the error, and yeah, you could say it's the size of the outcome, but I just felt, I mean, Verstappen, obviously, he's human, he makes mistakes, he dances on that high wire incredibly like nobody else, and every now and again you will slip off it. You wouldn't be human if you didn't. All the greats have done this, and 22 drivers went into that corner knowing it was the slippery one. Only one driver put it in the wall. Yeah, Bortoletto spun as well.
He was very lucky not to put it in the wall too, wasn't he?
Yeah, and he was very lucky not to be wiped out by Hulkenberg. What could have happened in that shunt doesn't bear thinking about. But yeah, it was just one huge error from Verstappen ultimately, and that. I mean, I did also think about the overall pace. I mean, the Red Bull's limited. It's been tricky judging Verstappen this year because the Red Bull's been quite an odd car. And I'd still have expected him to have a little bit more of an advantage over Lawson, to be honest. Be only a 10th ahead of him in qualifying. So that partly played into the thinking. I would say it was pretty close between Sainz and Verstappen. And if anybody put Verstappen 21st and Sainz 22nd, I wouldn't have a problem with that at all. But it was just that single catastrophic error that just made it relatively easy. Sainz was stupid. Really don't need to do that. But at least there were kind of circumstances in that he was battling with his teammate. I think if it had been a really Larry aggressive move, then maybe that would have made him get 22nd, but he locked up on that bump, and again, a mistake. It happens. It's just funny that he is. You could argue he's regressing to the mean after his good start to the season. A lesson in sample sizes there, but he also had problems with the car during the weekend. But often that's been the case with the Williams drivers, and it was interesting actually that Albon ended up ranked 8th by me, which is one of the position. I think that's the position that Sainz has had most regularly this season. So Albon and Sainz almost swap positions to an extent in that regard.
Do you think you maybe also slightly inverted your own methodology here, because Sainz, it sounds like he had more of a poor overall weekend? I think there is a mitigating factor of the Williams parts just being a bit tired. Both drivers mentioned that. So maybe his car was degrading a bit more than Albon's, but also Sainz went off, I think, in practice. So there's a certain element of looking after your own car. Whereas Verstappen's weekend was pretty tidy. I know he wasn't feeling very well, but it was pretty tidy until that obviously massive accident. But the error was also quite tiny. I watched the Sky coverage and they showed both he and Lawson going through that final corner, and Lawson being on a slightly wider line, but they didn't pick up on the fact that Lawson had a moment coming into that corner which put him on the wider line, and Verstappen didn't have that moment, ended up on the inside and then had the crash. So you could say, as you did at the start of your answer, that it was a massive outcome for a small error. But yeah, I just wonder if maybe we've had questions about this before. Is Verstappen on a slightly higher pedestal? Is he being held to a higher standard and being greatly punished for what in the end was a small mistake with big consequences? Whereas, as I say, Sainz had a kind of generally poor weekend compared to what we're used to from him.
Yeah, again, like I say, it was very close, so that it could be that. But I think in terms of the scale of the mistakes, one of the things I think is when you get a driver like Verstappen, I will always praise their general execution and the fact they don't make these mistakes, because that's the really impressive thing. They can dance on these limits without slipping off them very often at all. So it was a small mistake, but it was also a mistake a lot of other drivers didn't make. So that's why I don't think he was a lunatic or stupid or reckless. It's not a sort of value judgment on anything about him as a driver, rather than just he took a little bit of a risk. He knew he had to race hard and maybe take advantage of the conditions there, because obviously that little bit of greasiness dried very, very, very fast. So I think he just rolled the dice a little bit and failed. He could have left a little bit more of a margin. And I'll always be positive and praise drivers for them doing that. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes if somebody has what looks like an easy weekend at the front, I might value it a little bit higher because of just their ability to constantly execute. Now, Sainz versus Verstappen, I think it just does come down to that thing, as I didn't think Verstappen's weekend was stunning. It's not like Verstappen was going to be P1 if he didn't have that, because he didn't look at his absolute very best, and some of that's the car obviously being tricky, but I don't think there was such a gargantuan offset between Sainz and Verstappen's level generally in the weekend. Sainz had some difficulties because he was having trouble with the car as well through the sprint elements, and there were some setup changes going on, etc. So there are a few reasons. They've often been the case with Albon. So is it a higher standard? It's hard to tell. I don't feel like it is, but it might be playing a part. The only thing I can say with certainty is I did swap them around a couple of times, so it was close and I did think about it. So what should we move on to now, Ben? I'm surprised we haven't gone to the very top of the rankings yet. Got to be going there, surely.
Well, yes, we are going there. We're going from the very bottom to the very top. Lando Norris, number one. This is the third time this season Lando Norris has claimed top spot in your rankings. That's the most times of any individual driver on the grid in 2026 so far, which I think reflects what an excellent job he's consistently been doing in that McLaren, regardless of recent upgrades, which have thrust it to the front. Rowan Machine wants to know whether there was any doubt for your number one choice for this race, and did you consider Alonso for number one? Well, Chris Parrott wondered how you weighed up Lando's poor restart against Antonelli in making your decision.
Yeah, actually, Alonso did sit at number one for quite a while in the end.
Provisional number one. There we go.
Yeah, he was on provisional pole. Partly, the difficulty was that obviously Alonso had this weekend, and actually a sprint race was good because he made up a number of positions in a race where nobody was passing. But both the qualifying sessions were ruined by problems outside of his control, and it made it. I almost feel like that cost him a shot at locking down that number one position. But equally, you could say Norris could he have done a bit better in sprint quali, maybe could have got sprint pole. So they did swap around a lot. And I think the final thing that elevated Norris and was the clincher in the end is I think it would have been possible to win this race in any of those top three cars. I think that would have been possible. Norris was absolutely stunning on the hards in terms of the pace he could get out of them. Piastri struggled, couldn't get them switched on. Norris is great at the time management side of things and the way he can do this. And I thought that was the thing that really made me think, actually, I think that just is enough to slip him ahead by a nose. But it's relatively late on in the process, actually. I got to that. I didn't think this was a weekend where there was a super obvious number one, because even with Norris, I thought brilliant race drive, but yeah, sprint wasn't perfect. And on other weekends, there may have been a driver who nailed the sprint and the race elements, and you said, yeah, actually they slip ahead, but not quite in this case. So yeah, I think in terms of that thing about being how strong he is and the fact he's had 3 top slots, Norris has had a really impressive season. I've been really, really convinced by the work he's been doing this season. The only caveat I've got to the conclusion that he's taken a proper big step since becoming world champion is he's not fighting for the championship. So all of those other pressures and things, how would he respond if there was more pressure on? And maybe we're going to get a chance to see that in the closing stages of the season if he can keep doing what he's doing. I wouldn't button it for Monza. To finish off, shall we have a look at the Driver Rankings Championship? This awards points to the top 10 in my rankings for each race based on the 25-18 usual F1 point scoring. So, Ben, what can you see?
Well, we have a new championship leader this time. Lando Norris is our new rankings top dog, overtaking Kimi Antonelli. Verstappen stays third despite his no score in Zandvoort, but Lewis Hamilton is now just 9 points back in 4th place. The top 10 is completed by Russell in 5th, Sainz in 6th, Gasly in 7th, Lawson in 8th, Leclerc in 9th, and Bortoletto in 10th. Fernando Alonso is the biggest mover, climbing to 13th from 16th as Aston Martin continues to gather some momentum, and obviously Alonso having a big score, placing top 2 in your rankings. But teammate Lance Stroll remains rooted to the bottom of the pile in terms of drivers who've scored points. He's tied at the back with Valtteri Bottas, just 1 top 10 appearance so far this season. If you discount, obviously, wildcard Yuki Tsunoda, he's got no points, so he's on the very back, but it's probably not fair to ascribe him that status considering he's only done 1 race.
Yeah, he'd have, if he'd not made that mistake on lap 43, he'd have jumped, 5 drivers, something like that. That would have been quite good. But anyway, yeah, it's interesting to see how that's shaping up. And again, I don't necessarily consider being low down as a massive critique on the season, because like the Cadillac drivers are down there, but it can be quite hard if you're in a Cadillac or an Aston Martin, or even in some circumstances a Haas if you're in the car that's not working well to impress. So it's interesting to see how well that's shaping up. And look at Alonso there on a charge. He'll get into the top 10 fairly soon. I have no doubt about that, because actually in the Aston Martin he can go racing, and that's going to be a big test for Stroll as well, because this is a weekend where Stroll did struggle. There are trickinesses in this car, but he was quite. I talked about the trade-offs at Zandvoort, but he tends to sort of want to really push the entries and really push the braking, and that really doesn't pay off that well at Zandvoort often, unless you can actually hold on to that time you make up on the way in. So
even in this generation of cars, I think it's generally quite problematic, isn't it, with lower downforce and skinnier tyres and just an overall lack of grip. I think a lot of drivers are struggling to kind of calibrate that entry phase correctly.
But there was an interesting thing. I'm just trying to see if I can find it. In one of the qualifying sessions, maybe sprint qualifying, he said words to the effect of, I just don't know how to go faster. And I interpreted that not as I'm useless, I can't go quick. So I'm just trying to see if I can find it. But I think it was struggling with working out the exact compromise of how you do it, how you piece it together. It's another really underestimated skill, from your own racing, that thing of really working out how you trade off the entry speed, the mid speed, the exit, and all of those things. It's a really hard equation to master sometimes, particularly a track like Zandvoort. And I just think your Stroll seemed to struggle with that. And it's one of the reasons why I think there are times when he's really properly quick and got plenty of ability, but it doesn't always manifest itself. Right, I think that brings this podcast to a close. Thanks very much, Ben, for joining me again. I don't know who'll be next time after Monza. Maybe you again. I will let you in again, but I do like the rotating cast element as well. It gives it a different feel each time. And remember, if you're not yet in the Race Members Club, hit the link in the episode description or head to Patreon and search for the Race Members Club to find out more about joining there. Not just rankings chat, but you get to ask questions for the post-race podcast. There's a thriving community, bonus in-car insights, podcasts where whoever's on the ground for us at the Grand Prix, me, John Noble, Scott Mitchell-Malm, Ben, Val, Josh, whoever, we chat through the day on Thursday, Friday and Saturday. But we'll be back in a couple of weeks with Rankings Chat, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.